The bones did not belong to a legendary champion. They belonged to a young man, maybe 17 to 19 years old, buried in ancient Athens. At first glance, he looked like many others, buried in the ancient world. But when researchers examined the skeleton closely, the marks on his bones completely broke the traditional image of Mycenaean Greece. 2 different sword wounds had cut deeply into his body earlier in his life, and the bone had healed. He survived those fights. Then a sling stone struck his head with enough force to kill him. 3 separate moments of extreme violence were recorded in a single skeleton before the age of 20. For centuries, our picture of Bronze Age Greek warfare came from epic poetry like the Iliad. We imagined noble kings and famous champions engaging in formal duels while armies watched. But the bones buried beneath ancient cities are telling a much grimmer, rougher story. Archaeologists examining skeletal remains from the Agora Cemetery in Athens, Grave Circle A at Mycenae, and Knossos on Crete kept finding the same brutal patterns. Sharp cuts from swords, cracked ribs, and arrow wounds appear frequently. Crucially, researchers noticed parry fractures in the ulna bone of the forearm. The ulna sits along the outside edge of the arm, and it takes damage when a person raises their arm to stop a weapon coming toward their head. Many of these fractures had completely healed, meaning the fighter survived, recovered for weeks or months, and returned to normal life before facing violence again. This violence was not limited to elite warriors fighting ceremonial battles. Men pulled from ordinary graves showed the exact same trauma as those in high-status burials. If war was just for noble champions, only the elites would carry these scars. Instead, the evidence shows a culture where skirmishes, border raids, and frontier violence were a constant reality for ordinary men. One burial group, known as Grave Circle N, even contained skulls with 3 fractures on the left side, pointing to deliberate, repeated blows during close combat. The violence even reached inside the households. Some skeletons identified as female show-broken metacarpals in their hands. These fractures happened during defensive actions or physical conflict, suggesting violence wasn't limited to distant battlefields. Communities were defending settlements, fighting over resources, and sometimes losing. The Mycenaean world was a place where ordinary people faced weapons, where raids happened constantly, and where young men fully expected to fight for their lives. Because the Mycenaeans built fortified cities and were buried with massive caches of weapons, archaeologists long assumed they were violent invaders. The old theory claimed that northern warriors swept into the Aegean, violently taking over the peaceful Minoan island culture. It was a simple, compelling story of total population replacement. But when scientists actually extracted genetic material from the enamel of Bronze Age teeth and sequenced the ancient genomes, the results forced a complete rewrite of history. The DNA came back wrong for an invasion. The genomes did not show 2 separate populations. They showed one. Researchers compared 19 ancient individuals, Minoans from Crete, Mycenaeans from the mainland, and people from southwestern Anatolia, against a massive database of over 330 ancient and 2,600 modern genomes. They used admixture analysis to sort the genetic data into clear ancestry components. The results showed both the Minoans and Mycenaeans shared the exact same main ancestry. About 75 to 80% of their DNA traced back to early Anatolian farmers who had moved into Greece and Crete thousands of years earlier, during the Neolithic period. The Mycenaeans were not outsiders who wiped out the Minoans. They were related communities evolving in the same region, sharing deep genetic roots. The DNA proved continuity, not replacement. But the genomes did hold one anomaly. The Mycenaeans carried a small extra genetic component that the Minoans completely lacked. About 4 to 16% of their ancestry came from ancient hunter-gatherers linked to the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the huge grasslands stretching north of the Black Sea. This specific genetic signature did not belong in the Mediterranean world at all. How did northern steppe ancestry end up inside the people who built Mycenaean Greece? Steppe populations are widely linked to the spread of Indo-European languages across large parts of Europe. The Mycenaeans wrote in Linear B, which recorded an early form of Greek, an Indo-European language. But archaeology alone had never found the Kurgan burial mounds or early horse gear that usually mark steppe migrations. The DNA revealed a hidden integration. Because relatively few genomes have been recovered from mainland Greece before 1700 BC, her researchers cannot yet pinpoint exactly when the steppe ancestry arrived, whether around 2200 BC or 2000 BC. But at some point, small groups of steppe-related people moved south, perhaps through the Balkans or via coastal travel across the Adriatic Sea. Elite warriors or pastoral groups entered Greece and slowly integrated with local societies. That tiny northern signal mixed into a southern civilization, creating the earliest known Greek-speaking culture without leaving an obvious trail of artifacts. We know exactly what that cultural blending looked like on the ground, thanks to a stone slab hidden in an olive grove. In 2015, archaeologists excavating near the Palace of Nestor at Pylos hit something unusual. It was an undisturbed shaft tomb, perfectly sealed since about 1450 BC. Because the heavy slab had collapsed and covered the opening thousands of years ago, ancient looters never found it. When researchers finally opened the grave, they found a man in his early 30s surrounded by a staggering hoard of wealth. More than 3,500 objects were packed so tightly around his body that excavators could barely separate them. Gold cups, bronze armor, boar tusks from a helmet, rings and weapons filled the dirt. They called him the Griffin Warrior. This tomb breaks nearly every expectation about early Mycenaean Greece. At that specific time in history, the Mycenaean mainland was just rising to power, while the Minoan civilization on Crete had dominated the region for centuries. Yet inside this mainland warrior's grave, Minoan-style objects appeared everywhere. One artifact, the Pylos combat agate, absolutely stunned experts. It was a seal stone smaller than a thumb, carved from agate with an impossibly detailed scene of two warriors fighting. The craftsmanship suggested an artistic tradition far more advanced than historians believed existed on the mainland. Who was he? The boar tusk helmet and weapons pointed to a warrior identity, but gold signet rings showing ritual scenes suggested he also held religious or administrative authority. Was he a foreign Minoan conqueror, taking over the mainland? Once again, DNA answered the question. Genetic analysis showed his ancestry definitively matched the local populations of the Peloponnese. He was not an outsider. He belonged to the region. This shifts how historians view the rise of Mycenaean power. Instead of foreign elites entering Greece, local mainland leaders were absorbing outside Minoan influences and building their own massive wealth. And that wealth wasn't just coming from Crete. Amber beads in the tomb traveled from northern Europe. Ivory plaques were carved from elephant tusks imported from distant lands. The Griffin Warrior was plugged into a trade network far larger than anyone originally realized. The true scale of that maritime network became undeniable when a broken clay cup turned up hundreds of kilometers away in Sardinia. It was unmistakable Mycenaean pottery. Then more pieces surfaced in Sicily, Italy, the Levant coast, and even near Egypt. This was happening around 1600 to 1100 BC, an era completely devoid of compasses or engines. How were they moving goods across a distance of roughly 4,000 kilometers, the equivalent distance between London and Baghdad? The written records from the palaces barely mention distant trade, focusing almost entirely on local administration. But the physical objects scattered across the Mediterranean tell a totally different story. Archaeologists turn to isotope analysis, reading the chemical fingerprints locked inside the materials. The isotopes broke the map wide open. Metals tested from Bronze Age artifacts matched Cypriot copper. Strontium and oxygen isotopes helped track the origin of other materials, while obsidian tools pointed to distant volcanic islands. Most incredibly, lapis lazuli found its way into the Mycenaean world. This deep blue stone's primary source was in Afghanistan, thousands of kilometers east of Greece. Because the Linear B tablets rarely mention these long-distance exchanges, researchers realized something complex was happening. The trade wasn't a rigid, palace-controlled monopoly. Private, opportunistic traders were likely sailing independently, stopping where markets appeared, and moving goods between ports without palace supervision. And they weren't sailing in small canoes. Multi-beam sonar, magnetometers, and remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, scanning the deep, dark seafloor of the Aegean, have begun finding the actual ships. Near the island of Modi, a wreck dating to the late Helladic 3 BC period revealed rows of almost identical amphorae. The standardized cargo proves this was a structured, planned trade mission, crossing open water. Ship remains suggest vessels could reach around 50 meters long, capable of carrying 10 to 20 tons of cargo. Underwater harbor structures near Assini show they engineered massive stone walls to protect fleets of this size. The Mycenaeans were an ocean-going powerhouse. While independent traders sailed the Mediterranean, the elites back home were trying to control everything they could on land. They built massive administrative centers at places like Pylos, Knossos, and Thebes, filling them with clay tablets. To manage their wealth, they used the Linear B script. When Michael Ventris finally deciphered the script in 1952, scholars realized it recorded an early form of Greek. But the tablets weren't poetry or royal propaganda. They were the dry paperwork of a massive economic machine. The records painstakingly track shipments of grain, flocks of sheep counted for wool, bronze supplies, and labor assignments. At the top of this system sat the Wanax, the king. For decades, historians looked at these repetitive inventories and assumed the Mycenaean world operated as a perfectly centralized palace economy. The palace was the unquestioned hub. Farmers produced grain, workers crafted goods, the palace collected it all and then redistributed it. But just as the DNA erased an invasion, the tablets themselves began to fracture the illusion of total palace control. Scribes sometimes wrote words that simply didn't fit a total dictatorship. The word damos appears in several tablets, referring to a local community or district. Some tablets even record land belonging specifically to the damos, rather than the palace. If the king owned everything, why track land owned by the community? Another word, kodona, refers to plots of land held by individuals or groups, suggesting private or semi-private farmland existed. Religious sanctuaries received offerings completely outside direct palace accounting, indicating temples managed resources independently. The rigid system was cracking at the edges. The tablets only reveal the palace's narrow view of the economy, not the whole truth. It is like trying to understand a modern economy using only the paperwork from a single government office. You see taxes and regulations, but you miss the millions of everyday transactions. The palaces were incredibly powerful, but they couldn't operate alone. They depended heavily on a vast, complex network of local communities negotiating for their own autonomy. The strangest part of this massive administrative bureaucracy is that it preserved something deeply sacred, completely by accident. The Linear B tablets were temporary office notes made of wet clay. Scribes wrote them quickly, stored them for administrative use, and intended to discard them once the information was no longer needed. But around 1200 BC, the Mycenaean world collapsed. The palaces burned, and the massive heat baked those temporary clay tablets into permanent stone. When archaeologists translated the inventory lists looking for sheep and grain, they found names hiding in the margins. Names of gods. Some made perfect sense. Zeus appeared as Daiwo. Poseidon appeared as Poseidao. But then, the tablets started revealing deities that completely broke the expected Olympian family tree. There was Potnia, a lady or mistress who received offerings, but the texts never explain who she is or what her story was. There was Ima Oto, a god receiving palace goods, whose name vanishes entirely after the Bronze Age. There was Manasa. There was Preswa. potentially an early form of Persephone. Dionysus is there, written as Dionyso, but he isn't the familiar classical god of wine and theater. The tablets connect him to chthonic worship, hinting at darker, deep earth rituals. Because writing disappeared completely for centuries after the Mycenaean collapse, these ancient traditions were forced underground into oral history. By the time later Greeks wrote down their myths, the pantheon had evolved significantly. Gods vanished, merged, or completely changed. The Bronze Age religious system wasn't just an early draft of classical mythology. It was a vast, mixed mosaic of local traditions, Indo-European beliefs, and older Aegean cults. We only know they existed because an accountant made a note of a grain offering, and then the building burned down. Whatever those forgotten gods truly meant to the people who worshiped them, the answers disappeared into the flames, leaving us with a pantheon preserved purely by destruction.